His autobiography. If nobody's bought it, you should invest in a copy. It's an excellent piece of writing, and Harry has a most interesting history, as you probably know. Now, I'm probably a little bit more upbeat than Lindsay. It's been a good year for the good guys, generally. Dmitry Medvedev is about to win the very democratic election, which is being held in Russia. He's the candidate not backed by the Germans, so the pro-German press and pro-German NGOs are, of course, rubbishing him, but he's a very nice chap, I'm told, and so is President Putin. Prince Harry has been doing good work shooting up Terry Taliban, which is marvellous to see, upsetting the radical Muslims, which is also very encouraging. He was, of course, defending good Muslims out in Afghanistan, including that very nice man, Hamid Karzai. And I think that the very fact that we were able to get Prince Harry out of Afghanistan shows that things are changing a little bit in Whitehall. Tony Blair was totally opposed to Harry going into active service for obvious reasons, because the man was a closet Republican. So that was a very, very encouraging development indeed, and that, of course, has gone all the way around the world. We've had excellent snow this winter, which has blown away the global warming nutters. Most global warming nutters these days, how to tell a global warming nutter, because they've all got flu in winter, because they all throw away their winter woolies. Or they're stuck by the side of the road because they gave up their snow tyres, winter tyres, and snow chains. It's absolutely marvellous. Snow cover is the greatest it's ever been for decades, probably since the 1930s, and the whole global warming thing is just starting to fall apart, which is very, very encouraging. And Obama, Senator Barak Hussein Obama, is about to come a cropper in the United States. So it's been a pretty good year. For those who don't know the problem with Obama, and by the time this is viewed on the internet, it will probably be all over the newspapers. He was born in Mombasa in Kenya. It's very interesting because that sits on British intelligence files. His father was close to the Mau Mau. He used to run guns and money into the Mau Mau. He was a link man between the Mau Mau and the German intelligence network in East Africa. And Obama was born in Mombasa in about 1960. His mother, we think, was one of Obama Sr.'s many mistresses. And the woman who is now dead, who was allegedly his mother, wasn't pregnant in July 1961, but Barack Hussein Obama claims to have been born in Honolulu on August 4th, 1961. Now, we have a doctor here, Owen, Dr. Lister would, I think, confirm. I'm not a medical man, but my understanding is that if a lady's giving birth in August, we like to see her pregnant in July. Since it's been established that his mother, alleged mother, wasn't pregnant in the July, his claimed birth on 4th August does seem to be coming under a certain degree of scrutiny. It's also nice to have a DNA relationship with your parents, and the DNA test that was done in respect of Barack Obama's claimed grandparents, I understand the CIA were unable to obtain a match. The CIA did it very well. I believe they did it at a fundraising dinner, and it's absolutely marvellous. You want to do a DNA test, nothing better than a glass of water. Because what you get with a glass of water, you get saliva for your DNA, and you've got fingerprints as well. It's an all-in-one, do-it-yourself, DIY DNA testing kit. And all the CIA did was slip in. You don't have to ask somebody to do a DNA test. They just took away a couple of glasses. Bag one for grandpa, bag one for grandpa, do a DNA test, no link, end of case. It's quite funny. Rudy Giuliani's people, this is an aside, but I think people are interested because Obama is making a lot of headway at the moment. Rudy Giuliani's people bought me lunch last year because they knew I knew, and Rudy's people were fascinated by this, and he decided to sit on it, apparently, and hold the intelligence back in the hope that he would be the Republican candidate, because he was then being talked about as the front runner, and then he could bounce it on the Democratic Party after the convention in August, which is absolutely crazy. I've been talking to Hillary Clinton's people who seem quite interested. So I don't think it'll be staying secret for much longer. So it's been a good year so far. Now, I'm now going to talk about what I've been asked to talk about, which is very rare for me, for those who've heard me before. Normally I talk about everything else that's not on the agenda. The legitimacy of our membership of the European community. Well, we should approach this logically, unlike Bob Lomas, no offence intended. We should approach it logically. Is our membership legal? Is it in accordance with constitutional principle, which is a different question altogether? And in the international plane, are we bound by the treaties? Why do I draw a distinction in what happens domestically and what happens internationally? Because We are a dualist jurisdiction. And in a dualist jurisdiction, treaties like this only take effect in the international plane. This treaty is not law. It can only be made law by Parliament, which is why we have the European Union Amendment Act going through, or the European Union Amendment Bill. If the bill is granted royal assent, and it may not be, entirely matter for the Queen whether she grants royal assent or not, entirely matter for the House of Lords whether they impose a referendum requirement. It may not make its way through the House of Lords. I suspect it won't. I suspect there will be a referendum successful amendment in the House of Lords. Note, for those who are interested in the treaty, the ratification of this treaty is currently suspended in Slovakia. Yes. The media have not picked up that, probably because they confused Slovakia with Slovenia and all went down to Zagreb instead of Bratislava, or what's the capital of Slovenia? It's not Zagreb. Zagreb's Croatia.
That's too fast a ball for me.
Sorry? Ljubljana, yes. Yes. Remind me. I've never been to Slovenia. I've been to Croatia. Sorry? Yes. Exactly. I've been to Croatia, but I don't think I've ever been to Slovenia. The media are probably confusing the two. Slovakia is the country where the treaty is held up. The opposition have more sufficient votes in the Slovakian parliament to block approval of the treaty. It requires a special majority. Although they don't have a simple majority to block the treaty, they have sufficient numbers to block the ratification. And in Slovakia, in Bratislava, it is suspended indefinitely. Now, when it's going to come back in, we don't know. The rumour in the intelligence community, and as you know, I'm not a spy, ladies and gentlemen, I just teach spies and do the odd bit of analysis for them and bail them out of trouble when they get into trouble, and spies do occasionally get into the odd bit of legal trouble. Not everything they do is entirely lawful. So I only advise spies and teach spies. I'm not a spy. But the word in the intelligence community is that we cut a deal with the Russians over Slovakia. The Russian SVR has very good connections in Bratislava. Surprise, surprise, it used to run the place. And when it was the KGB, and the rumour, although I can't confirm this, it's only a rumour, the rumour is we cut a deal to bump off that idiot Georgian who surprisingly dropped dead of a heart attack just a couple of weeks ago. And that happened about 2 days after the Slovakian Parliament blocked the Treaty of Lisbon. But it's only a rumour. I'd be fascinated to know exactly who was doing what to whom. But because the treaty only operates in the international plane, you have to get an Act of Parliament through in order to incorporate it. If there was no European Communities Act, nothing in the Treaty of Rome would be lawful in this country at all. Now, it is also the case under the British Constitution that Parliament is supreme. Parliament can do whatever it likes. I know there's a group of people, including Bob Lomas and others, who waste a lot of time and in some cases money with pointless legal challenges, pretending that Parliament cannot enact any law that it wants whatsoever. Parliament can do whatever it likes, providing the Queen gives royal assent, which is essential, providing it goes through the House of Lords and the House of Commons, subject to the Parliament Act procedure. What you end up with is an act, and that is the law of the land. Now, the fact we may not like the European Communities Act, I'll take questions there, providing it's enacted, then it is the law of the land. You don't have to like it. It doesn't have to be sensible. Parliament has passed a lot of daft legislation, the Witchcraft Act, the European Communities Act, the Dangerous Dogs Act, the Human Rights Act, the Lisbon Treaty Act. I mean, all these are daft, ridiculous bits of legislation, but they are legislation. Now, the Witchcraft Act, which was last used in 1944, I don't know if people realise that, the Telegraph covered it recently. The Witchcraft Act was most recently used in England for a prosecution in 1944 when a medium was prosecuted for witchcraft and adjudged to be a witch. That was completely stupid, but lawful, because the Act of Parliament, the Witchcraft Act, was still in place, and Parliament can do what it likes. And if we all know there are no witches, but if Parliament says there are witches, then as far as the law is concerned, there are witches. And this poor lady was prosecuted and sent to prison for 2 years for being a witch. Now, there's an interesting historical intelligence background to that, because none other than Winston Churchill, when still Prime Minister, went to see this lady in prison. Why did Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, go to see a witch who had been sent to prison for 2 years? Because at the séance, which led to such hysteria, she had announced that HMS Barham had been sunk in the Med in November 41. and that at that stage was still very much on the secret list. You may recall the tragic photograph. The German intelligence had ambushed the Barham, and somebody arranged in naval intelligence to have the battleship next ahead in line. There was somebody with a camera. Normally you don't see battleships being torpedoed and sunk because normally it comes as a surprise. In a well-ordered naval battle, we like the Navy to be taken by surprise by a torpedo. And normally people are not there at sea in wartime with a camera already rolling as the ship is torpedoed. In this particular case, somebody was there waiting with a camera as the torpedo went in. The poor old Barham got hit in the magazines and went over. The reason Churchill was interested was the name of the spy, and he probably thought the medium knew the name of the British spy who betrayed HMS Barham's course to the Germans through the German ambassador in Ankara, Franz von Papen, who was, of course, close to German intelligence, so close he was actually part of it. And who was that spy? None other than Harold Macmillan, who took us, or tried to take us, into the EEC, who was exposed as a German spy in International Currency Review, volume 30, number 4, and I'd strongly recommend it, published in the autumn of 2005. And I suspect Churchill, even as early as 1944, had suspicions about Harold Macmillan. He also betrayed HMS Ark Royal, which had sunk a few days earlier from memory. Now, because Parliament can enact the Witchcraft Act, the Dangerous Dogs Act, the Human Rights Act, it follows that the European Communities Act is law. Constitutional lawyers are taught this year one. When you study constitutional law, the rule is the blue-eyed baby rule. For some reason, at some point, some constitutional professor must have been annoyed by somebody with blue eyes or didn't like Frank Sinatra's records. I don't know, but it's always expressed as the blue-eyed baby rule. Parliament can enact a law which says that every blue-eyed baby shall be killed. And if House of Lords approved it, and if the Queen were to give assent, of course she wouldn't, but if she were, then every blue-eyed baby, in theory, would be liable to be killed. If Parliament can say that every blue-eyed baby, or every second blue-eyed baby, can be put to death, then Parliament can enact the European Communities Act. It doesn't matter how daft, how stupid, how crazy a bill is, if Parliament approves it, it becomes law. And there is no point going to a court of law and saying we don't like this Act of Parliament. This has happened. I know there's a crowd of Eurosceptics who over the years have been enthralled with this idea that the European Communities Act isn't valid and you can go off to court and challenge it. All these challenges have failed, and rightly so, because they're all completely misconceived, because there's no point going to a court of law and saying to the judge, I don't like X Act of Parliament. The judge will say, tough, I've duty bound to apply it. Mike Burke tried it when he challenged the Firearms Act 1997. Now, the Firearms Act 1997 was a completely stupid piece of legislation, blaming shooters for the shooting at Dunblane. There was no problem with firearms law. The problem was that we gave guns to a nutter who happened to be running a paedophile ring, who happened to have paedophiles in the police force that he was supplying children to. Therefore he got protection. Therefore he got a firearms certificate that he shouldn't have got. But that was because he had protectors in the police force. Nothing to do with firearms legislation. There was nothing wrong with the legislation. It was just the way it was being worked. The Parliament had a hissy fit, and the shooters were prosecuted in a great moral fit of outrage, totally unnecessary, and somebody went to court and said the Firearms Act is illegal because it breaches the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights says every Protestant has the right to bear arms, and Mike Burke went along and said, hey, I'm a Protestant, I'm in the Church of whatever, Church of England, I'm a Protestant, I have a right to bear arms, this act cannot apply to me because of the Bill of Rights. Wrong, case chucked out, and rightly so. So the European Communities Act is undoubtedly law. However, and I will take questions later, however, the other side of the coin, which is equally uncomfortable to Euro nutters, is that Parliament remains sovereign. It's omnipotent in all save the power to destroy its own omnipotence, as Sir Robert McGarry said in 1982 in the Canadian Indians case, ex parte manual. It's Queen versus Attorney General of Canada, ex parte manual. The Parliament remains sovereign and omnipotent, and it follows that whatever Parliament can do, it can also undo. So although Parliament enacted the European Communities Act, it can also repeal it. And the law of this country is quite clear that Parliament can override all previous legislation without referring to it, impliedly or expressly. Now, that is what we argued in Metric Martyr. And in Metric Martyr, the courts accepted at least half of our argument. The courts accepted that the European Communities Act could be repealed, that there had been no loss of sovereignty. And in order to determine the impact in Britain of European community law, you had to look at what Parliament had said. Now that is right. That's a dualist decision. It's correct. Previously, we had had a decision called Factortame in 1988, which was a monist decision. But it had been heard without argument. It wasn't binding precedent. The judges in Factortame, not having their attention drawn to basic principles of the British Constitution, no offence intended, reached the wrong decision. They regarded the Treaty of Rome as having some legal effect in England, even without parliamentary sanction. And they handed down what purported to be an order setting aside the Merchant Shipping Act 1988, which, with great respect to the House of Lords, is an obvious nonsense. Every British constitutional lawyer knows that that was just a piece of paper. Nobody, in fact, acted on it. Parliament itself later repealed the Merchant Shipping Act 1988. I have no doubt that at some point the implied repeal part of Thoburn will be overturned, and that could happen as early as this year with Metric Martyr number 2. It's not widely known, Mr. Chairman, but in the Thoburn case, the authorities on which the court relied were authorities which were not put to me or my learned friend Eleanor Sharpston, who was my opponent. We were never told about them. This idea that a constitutional statute cannot be impliedly repealed was dreamt up by the judges after argument. We were never called back, as it should have been, and said, hey, what about this point? In fact, in argument, some of you may have been here when I was arguing Metric Martyr. In argument, when I said to the judges, there are no such things as constitutional statutes, there's either a statute or there isn't, they said, we're not in the first year of law school, Mr. Shrimpton, you don't need to tell us that. So they actually accepted my point in argument and then went away, looked up some cases which had nothing to do with the point, and came back and handed down this decision. A few weeks later, the Foreign Office revealed that the Attorney General, Sir Peter Rawlinson, and the Solicitor General, and the Lord Advocate for Scotland, and the Solicitor General for Scotland had advised that my argument was correct in a joint opinion to the government in 1971. But that opinion was suppressed during Metric Martyr number 1. Now, that's the domestic plane. Parliament can do what it likes, but having done what it likes, it can carry on doing what it likes, and it can therefore undo what it has already done. The Witchcraft Act has been repealed. I'm sure, no doubt that the European Communities Act, which is almost as silly as the Witchcraft Act, possibly even sillier, will be repealed in due course. I turn now to the international plane, which is, and I apologise, this is law, so it's dull, and I hope I'm not presenting it too dully. I can't hear anybody snoring. Law is usually dull. International law, however, is not so dull, particularly when we're involved with Edward Heath. Now, in the international plane, the UK is not bound by the Treaty of Accession. Why do I say that? Because Article 50 of the Law of Treaties. Now, international conventions are governed by the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. It applies to the Treaty of Rome. The European Court of Justice have applied it. There's no doubt it applies to all international treaties. It is a codified treaty enacting how it's basically treaty law. Article 50 of the Vienna Convention says that if the expression of a state's consent to be bound by a treaty has been procured through the corruption of its representative by another negotiating state, the state may invoke such corruption as invalidating its consent to be bound by the treaty. Oh yes, indeedy. If you buy up the signatory of a state in international law, that state is not bound by the signature. Makes sense. I mean, if you're bribing the other party, how can that party bind the state who they're representing? Now, in 2005, International Currency Review exposed Edward Heath and Roy Jenkins and Madron Seligman and Geoffrey Rippon QC as agents of the German intelligence organisation, the DVD. Now, not everything in this is right. It's actually the Deutsche Verteidigungsdienst, not the Deutsche Versicherungsdienst. Versicherungs is, I think we've got some German speakers here, Versicherungs is insurance. Versicherungs was used as a cover. There was a German insurance office called the DVD, which was used as a cover for the intelligence agency. The intelligence agency is the Verteidigungsdienst, the German defence service. What happened in 1944, and this part of the article, Edward Heath, an agent of the Nazi International, which is not language I would use, but that part of the article is right. In the autumn of 1943, not 44 as said here, in the autumn of 43, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris realised Germany was losing. In fact, he probably realized Germany was losing on September 4th, 1939. He was in fact opposed to the invasion of Poland. And Harry might know this from his intelligence background. Admiral Canaris actually tried to stop World War II because he realized Germany was on a loser. And he actually sent some Abwehr officers into Poland to tip off the Poles by mounting an attack in advance of the German advance, the idea being to get the Poles mobilized so that Admiral Canaris could then go to Hitler and say, oh, that somehow, I don't know how, Herr Führer, but somehow the Poles have discovered we're about to attack. That crazy operation went wrong because the telephone had broken down from this railway station. The whole operation was completely crazy. When a bunch of German agents go and take over a railway station inside Poland, well in advance of the main Wehrmacht attack, that the telephone wires had broken down between there and Warsaw. So he got a Polish army officer trying to get through to headquarters, and his communications had gone, and he had no radio. The whole thing was a complete farce, straight out of Carry On Spying. And that attempt to stop the invasion of Poland failed. Germany invaded Poland, started World War II, and lost. One of the reasons why Canaris didn't want Germany to start World War II is because he already had Stalin signed up, he had Molotov signed up, and Beria, and in the United States he had key people including Eisenhower, the Dulles brothers, and in Britain he had Attlee, he had Heath, he had a whole bunch of people. Roy Jenkins, they were fairly junior at that point, but he had the Cabinet Secretary, Lord Hankey, known in the intelligence community as Harry may know as Hanky Panky, because he was into little boys and he'd been supplied with little boys by the German intelligence. They had brothels supplying. They basically had sort of male brothels and female brothels. They had 2 at Cambridge, 2 at Oxford. One did women, one did boys, and they had one in London that did boys, which was run out of Toynbee Hall. Arnold Toynbee was also a German intelligence officer, and they signed up people basically at university. They were very, very good at honey trapping people at university, and once they signed them up early, they tended to keep them going for the rest of their lives. Macmillan was signed up at university, Heath was signed up at university. Sometimes they were paid. Heath was paid £250 a year in Reichsmarks just before the war, which is a fair old sum. Heath was also honey trapped, combination of payment and honey trap. Now, you probably know the famous story that Heath and Madron Seligman, his then boyfriend, and I met Madron, he's a perfectly nice chap, but gay, and Heath and Madron were sharing a tent, and they were running around on a camping expedition in August 1939, just prior to the invasion of Poland, and they crossed the German-Polish frontier. So just picture this, ladies and gentlemen. You've got Germany poised to invade Poland, you've got security restrictions, you've got German armies on the German side of the frontier, and a couple of Brits, homosexuals, sharing a tent with the full knowledge of the Gestapo, trot across from Germany into Poland in August 1939, go and have a powwow with the British ambassador in Warsaw, and then go back to Germany. Huh? Heath's official version of events is, oh, we were going back home. So they went back home in August 1939 to London from Warsaw via Berlin. Yes, I can see why they would choose that. Obvious route, isn't it? Yes. Never mind, let's go to Stockholm. let's go to Oslo. let's sail across the Baltic. They went back into Germany. And the official version of events is that they were welcomed back into Germany by the border guards, who of course work closely with intelligence. Oh, hello, Mr. Heath. Hello, Mr. Seligman. Still sharing a tent. The idea that the Gestapo couldn't count tents, the idea that these 2 chaps sharing a tent. It's all farcical. Of course, Heath was carrying a message back from the British ambassador in Warsaw to Berlin. That was the whole point. Now, Heath and Ripon were both on the German payroll and were still on the payroll in 1972. This is why Heath was able to buy an ocean-going racing yacht when his official salary was, I think, £16,000 a year. Now, he couldn't buy or run an ocean racing yacht on £16,000 a year, as well as a house in London. And a grand piano, exactly. It's all nonsense. The yacht was bought for him by the DVD. The DVD kept him on the payroll. Heath was worth well over £1 million when he died. I mean, he had about £500,000 worth of artwork on the home of his house in London. After 1972, the Germans switched the financial arrangements to Peking, and he was put on the board of some companies in Peking. There are various ways of laundering money. Some of it was laundered through Peking. Interesting postscript to the Morning Cloud. When Heath lost the election in 1974, and it looked as though the referendum, it looked as though we were actually going to pull out of the EU, the Germans threw a hissy fit and sank his boat. Somebody pulled the plug on Morning Cloud. It sank in very mysterious circumstances on a very fine day in the Channel. I think one cabin boy, in inverted commas, died. Heath wasn't on the boat. Whether he was tipped off or not, I don't know. Absolutely entertaining. The story of the sinking of Morning Cloud is almost as interesting from an intelligence perspective as the story is how he acquired it. But it doesn't matter how much he was paid, or where he was paid, or how he was paid. The fact is, Heath was on the German payroll. Result, international law, we are not bound by the Treaty of Accession. We can walk out of the EU in the international plane at any time by simply saying, well, I'm sorry, chaps, you shouldn't have bought up our Prime Minister since he was on your payroll. You're lumbered. End of story. The story in which the EU was set up all involves and turns around German intelligence. Jean Monnet was a German agent. Jean Monnet ran the League of Nations for German intelligence from about 1919 with Arthur Salter, who was also a German agent. Monnet was involved in shipments of gold and currency out of Germany in 44-45. They didn't lose gold in lakes. You don't lose gold in a lake. You're not driving along on a road in Germany with half a ton of gold in the back of your Kubelwagen and say, what are we going to do, chaps? I know, we'll chuck it in the nearest lake. Gold may have been deposited in lakes and very carefully marked for later retrieval, but nobody threw away gold. You don't throw gold away. It's one of the things you don't do. If you had a bar of gold, would you throw it away? There's the nearest river, chuck it in the river. This idea that the Germans lost gold in 44-45 is a fantasy. Of course they didn't lose gold. Monnet, one of his jobs was to secrete gold and assets out of Germany, 44-45, and a lot of them went down to Buenos Aires. Another of his little jobs had been, he was an arms broker during World War II. One of his jobs was to try and acquire for the Germans, I think vanadium. There were one or two metals that the Germans couldn't get that they were able to supply. Monnet was organising through his contacts and brokerage houses in New York. So Monnet was a German spy, so was Paul Henry Spark. The FBI had a file on Monnet. Monnet used to meet with the German head of station at Mexico City, and the FBI tracked him down. It's one of the reasons why the FBI were excluded from post-war external intelligence, because they were too good. Edgar Hoover had spotted Monnet as a German spy, and I've actually spoken to FBI counterintelligence contacts who were familiar with that operation. One of the FBI agents on it died recently, aged about 83, lovely guy, and he was actually on the team monitoring and spotting Monnet's dealings with German intelligence in Mexico City in World War II. Charles Guggenheim, don't know what his relationship was, but I can tell you Cord Meyer Jr. was an agent of the German DVD. You can't understand the CIA without understanding the DVD, because the DVD set up the CIA. The DVD controlled the SOSS. The list of German spies inside American intelligence in World War II is quite a long one. It starts with Donovan. Donovan was a Catholic. He was signed up through the Vatican. Donovan, the Dulles brothers, Richard Helms, Bill Casey, all worked for Admiral Canaris. Canaris actually had meetings with the Dulles brothers. The Dulles brothers were operating out of a flat in Bern, and Canaris would slip across the frontier into Switzerland for meetings with the Dulles brothers. The Dulles brothers would try to negotiate a separate peace between the United States and Germany in the autumn of 1943. So when the CIA was set up, its first director was in fact a German agent, a man by the name of Roscoe Hillenkoetter, not widely known outside the intelligence community. Harry will know him. Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter had been a German agent at Pearl Harbor. He was the chap who was supplying the Japanese with the dispositions of the US Pacific Fleet. He was executive officer on the USS West Virginia. So you have this extraordinary collection of German spies. Alan Welsh Dulles takes over the CIA. Cord Meyer was one of Alan's boys. Cord Meyer Jr., who was a friend of a friend. I never met him, but I know people who did. He used to live at Eaton Square, not far from Enoch Powell. Cord was working for the Germans, and it was the Germans who arranged the money. That's how Charles Guggenheim was paid. And who was in charge of the Yes campaign in 75? None other than Roy Jenkins. And who was Roy Jenkins working for? Well, Roy Jenkins was exposed as a member of the Oxford Ring. He was recruited and spotted. And Harry may tell you, if you ask him nicely and buy a pint, that Roy was spotted when he was working for the Jerrys inside Bletchley Park in 1944. That he was moved, I think, to the administration hut, wasn't he? Yes, as Harry's nodding. Yes, some idiot in counterintelligence said, we can't expose Bletchley, we can't prosecute him. They should have just taken him out the back and shot him. But, never mind a trial. We couldn't have a trial because that would expose Bletchley Park. Well, Bletchley Park was on the secret list. So Jenkins is spotted, moved into the administration hut, a typical British counterintelligence, woolly, muddle-headed thinking he'll do less damage if we put him in the administration hut. Of course, what does he get in the administration hut? All the names of everybody working at Bletchley. God. One of the biggest counterintelligence mistakes of World War II. And what happened in 1945? Bletchley shut down under pressure from the Germans. And, of course, MI5 never get the counterintelligence files from Bletchley. So nothing was done about Jenkins until, oh dear, just before he died. In fact, Jenkins died because he was tipped off that he was about to be exposed, he had a heart attack and keeled over. That, we believe, is why Jenkins died. Now, I could go on for another half an hour and bore you to tears. Basically, summation of what I'm saying, or summary if you prefer English. The European Communities Act is valid because Parliament can do what the hell it likes. But because it can do what it likes, it can also undo what it has already done. So with no loss of sovereignty, we can repeal, amend the European Communities Act at will. If we want to pull out, we just repeal the European Communities Act. Because of international law, we are not bound by the Treaty of Accession because our two signatories were bent and were on the payroll of another signatory. End of story in international law. We are not bound by the Treaty of Accession. And the whole story of how the EEC comes about, all the key players in the formation of the EEC, particularly those who pushed UK entry, are all, or were all, German intelligence assets. Macmillan promotes Heath. Macmillan was working for the Jerrys in World War II, and afterwards Heath was working for the Jerrys. Roy Jenkins arranges for Heath to come into power in 1970 with that daft budget in 1970, which undermined Harold Wilson's position. Jenkins working for the Germans. One key player after another. Harold Wilson was another man who worked for the Germans in World War II. He supplied them with economic intelligence. One key player after another. It's amazing. Harold Wilson was spotted as a spy, and they really thought he was Russian. He wasn't a Russian spy, he was a German spy. Trouble was, his control was in Moscow, and the Germans had penetrated Russian intelligence, and they were using their assets in Russian intelligence to control Harold Wilson. All of that ring, the Cambridge ring of spies, Victor Rothschild and Kim Philby, whose father was a German spy, Harold, Burgess, Maclean, Cairncross, Blunt, that crowd were all German spies. They'd all worked for the Germans. One of them, I think, was a banking officer with Rothschilds in the 1930s. Rothschilds didn't employ that many communists. It's amazing how many trails all lead back to Germany, and you cannot understand the EU, ladies and gentlemen, unless you understand German intelligence. You cannot understand British politics or German politics or American politics without understanding the role of the German DVD. You cannot make sense of the assassination of President Kennedy unless you know Richard Helms was a DVD officer and was trying to get Alan Welsh Dulles back in control of the CIA, which he'd lost when Kennedy came in and appointed John McCone to run the CIA. You cannot understand American politics unless you know Eisenhower was a German agent. You cannot understand American politics unless you know Nixon also worked for the Germans, and then Nixon ratted on the Germans, which is why key German assets in Washington were involved in his replacement in Watergate. Nothing makes sense of politics, the EEC or the EU, unless you understand the role of intelligence. It's not just a political problem, it's not just an economic problem, it is a counterintelligence problem as well. And we have to get out. We also have, but it's not just sufficient, ladies and gentlemen, just to leave the EU. Yes, we must leave the EU. Yes, it's a nonsense. But we must also sharpen up our Counterintelligence Act and make sure that those who are continuing to report to the Germans, those who are disloyal to this country, are not in any position of power and influence. And we absolutely must break the German networks in Britain and Washington. Hope that was not too dull. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Established that EU law is superior to British law.
Did
not the factor tame case establish that EU law is superior to British law?
No.
And if not, why not?
The following question. Factor tame was, and I've been accused of speaking too quickly, so I shall slow down. Factor tame was the case about the Merchant Shipping Act. The Merchant Shipping Act was 1988, therefore clearly took precedence over the European Communities Act. That is straightforward British constitutional law, legis posteriores. The later law takes precedence over the earlier law. When the Spanish Factortame Company, which was a front company, it had no assets, and who was backing it apart from the Spanish government is unclear. But when Factortame, which was a front, took its case to the House of Lords, there was no effective challenge. The Attorney General did not argue the constitutional principle that one Act of Parliament could not bind its successor. Now, in 1971 and 72, Parliament was told in terms that that is what would happen, that if the Costa case and the Van Genden-Loos case, the European Court of Justice cases were all known about. They were referred to in the parliamentary debates in 71-72. The House of Commons was told by Sir Geoffrey Howe, we went into this in Metric Mater, and the House of Lords was told by the Lord Chancellor, Lord Hailsham, that in the event of a Factortame type situation, a later Act of Parliament breaching community law, the courts would give effect to the later Act. Now, the House of Lords failed to give effect to the Merchant Shipping Act, but their decision was not binding because nobody had argued the point. And in Thoburn, my opponent eventually accepted that Factortame was not binding authority, and the court said it was wrong. And the court said that you had to look to the British Constitution. So Factortame did not lay down any legal principle at all. It is not binding precedent because the key point was not argued. The leading case on the relationship between European law and British law is Thoburn, which was argued, partly by me, of course. And in Thoburn, it said that you had to look to the British Constitution, not the European Community. So Factortame, A, bad law, B, not binding law, and the key case is Thoburn. Lindsay?
No comment.
No,
no, you're the expert on that.
I'm sure I got notice of at least half a dozen questions during the helpful tea interview. Who is selecting? Yes, come on.
I have here your CV, which I downloaded from the UKNDA site, which a friend and I are looking at, because
yes.
we seem to feel it's funded by the EU, but you might or might not want to deny that.
No.
I'm somewhat concerned about upsetting this man, because he knows so many spies I could vanish off the face of the earth. However, I'm going to do my best, because firstly, the blue-eyed baby boy argument,
yes.
Parliament may not pass a law that says all blue-eyed baby boys can be killed. The reason they cannot is because the Declaration of Rights says that there can be no, hold on, don't shake your head, there can be no cruel or inhuman punishments inflicted. And the people of this country in 1689 refused the permission of the people in this country for the sovereign to pass that bill, to anything that does that. So, in fact, the people of this country have prevented the sovereign giving the royal assent, and therefore Parliament cannot pass a bill to which the royal assent cannot be given.
That's true.
That is correct. So the Parliament could not pass a law ordering that all blue-eyed baby boys should be killed. They cannot. They have been refused that permission.
Right.
Parliament feel that the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Rights, does not apply to them. It does because it affects what the Queen can give permission for Parliament to do, and that specifically refuses a large number of things for the sovereign.
Right. Can I deal with that? There are two parts to your question. The first part.
That wasn't a question. That was a statement.
Yes. With respect, I think we're in question time, aren't we?
Yeah. Right. Yes. Okay. Right. Well, now.
I've got your first point, which is Bill of Rights.
Okay.
Second point, royal assent.
Now, in your CV,
yep.
You actually represented or advised the peers, the hereditary peers, who were being thrown out of the House of Lords.
Correct.
Some of them. Well, some of them.
Yep.
You advised the Metric Martyrs. You took part in the Metric Martyrs case.
Yep. Leading counsel.
And you advised the fishermen about the loss of their fishing industry.
Correct, yes.
Right?
Yep.
All of which are of major constitutional importance
yes.
to this country. Now, I would say that in the Navy, we have a saying. The first time's an accident, the second time's a coincidence, and the third time is enemy action. None of these cases were won. Whose side are you on?
Right, well, that's your third point. I'll answer the third one. The home side, the home team, the UK. Let's just deal with those three cases. Only in one of those cases did I argue the case in the point of law, and we won on the several issues. We didn't just... Metric Martyr involved a whole series of points, most of which we won. If I start with the first case you mentioned, the fishermen, I was instructed by a group of Cornish fishermen in 1992 in Nellin, who were opposed to the factor tame decision, and my advice went to Bill Wade, then our leading constitutional lawyer, sadly no longer with us. I think Bill actually agreed with it, and I said in that advice exactly what I said today and in Metric Martyr, that the Merchant Shipping Act was law, could not be set aside, the House of Lords were wrong, but the fishermen didn't have resources to take the case forward, and the company which instructed me was, I suspect, I mean I don't know, but all I know is that the case was not taken forward. So although I advised them, and advised them correctly, it was up to them to take the case, there were no funds. There may have been political pressure down in Cornwall, I know not, but that case was never taken forward. So I never appeared as counsel in factor tame. But I said to them exactly as I said to you this afternoon, and I copied my opinion to Bill Wade, author of Wade's Constitutional Law, who was then the leading constitutional lawyer in this country. And Bill also saw my opinions in Metric Martyr. He loved them. I mean, you know, we had... I'm blowing my own trumpet, but since nobody else will, I have to blow my own occasionally. All of my paperwork in Metric Martyr, my skeleton argument, my opinions, all went up to Bill Wade in Cambridge. And he could see, I think, you know, he understood what I was arguing. In the second case you mentioned, which was the peers, I wasn't arguing a case in a court of law. I advised the peers, a group of about 30 peers, as a constitutional expert, on the status of the so-called Parliament Act 1949. But again, politics came into play. There was no legal challenge to the House of Lords Reform Bill because Lord Strathclyde cut a deal and the Parliament Act was not used. The advice I gave was that the Parliament Act 49, so-called, was not an Act of Parliament because it had not been approved by the House of Lords. And the Commons could not enlarge its own powers at the expense of the Parliament as a whole without the sanction of Parliament. Now, I still regard that as sound. Because the Parliament Act was not used, there was no case. So we didn't lose the case, there was no case. In factor tame, I didn't lose the case, I gave correct advice, but it wasn't acted on and I never argued the case at all. The only time I've argued it is Metric Martyr number 1. Now, Metric Martyr number 1, we dispensed with factor tame. There were probably there were so many points in that case. On five issues, we won. We only lost on the implied repeal issue. We won on factor tame not being authority. It was a bitter contest. Hours were spent arguing that, but it was eventually conceded after I cited a series of cases, some Canadian, that if a point is not argued in a court of law, it's not binding precedent. That point we won on. We won on our interpretation of the Weights and Measures Act. People said the Weights and Measures Act did not authorise the use of the pound. That was a big point on which we won. And that clears the way for victory in Metric Martyr number 2, because it's established now that the Weights and Measures Act does permit you to use pounds or kilograms. It's either or. So we won on that point. We won on the domino effect. This point was complex, but essentially the reason, part of the reason the case was so extensive and took so much time, a lot of time was taken up on what was the relationship between the regulations made under the 85 Act, which had a Henry VIII power, and the Henry VIII order made under the 72 Act. There were two separate sets of Henry VIII orders. one purportedly under the European Communities Act, one purportedly under the Weights and Measures Act. And we argued successfully, I don't think anybody's on their way to arrest me, or Lindsay, we argued successfully that because the scheme depended on the European Communities Act, Henry VIII power, if we knocked that one out, the Weights and Measures Act amendments also went. And on that point won. That was a big point. We won on the jurisdictional point. Huge row to start with. You can't take these points in a magistrate's court. Well, the Sunderland eventually gave way on that. They didn't. There was a lot of toing and froing, but they eventually agreed. Yes, it was open to Steve Thoburn to argue these constitutional points in Sunderland Magistrates Court, and we did, with the world's press in attendance. We won. There was another big argument about costs, because costs are being used as a weapon, and much of the legal argument was about costs orders, and we won. Sunderland said they would not enforce a £50,000 order for costs in the magistrates' court if he didn't take his case to appeal, which we said was, well, blackmail is a word I wouldn't use because I'm a barrister, but others might. But certainly pressure. Now, we won on the very important point that since they hadn't got their costs in the magistrates' court, they couldn't recover them in the divisional court. There was another point about whether the Metric Martyr Defence Fund could be ordered to pay the costs. Well, we said no, they couldn't, and we were right on that. The only point, when the big point, the factor-tame point, we said factor-tame was wrong, which is exactly what I told the fishermen back in '92, that European law does not take effect in this country without an Act of Parliament. On that we won. Hugely important point, because it shifted the whole emphasis of whether European law is supreme from what the European law says to what British law says. And that upset a lot of people. Lord Leicester of Herne Hill, some of you may have seen the email remarks recently. Tony Leicester, very upset about that. And you can see his upset in black and white in the House of Lords Committee, which looked at this a couple of years ago, where my opponent was giving evidence. Philip Moser, the junior counsel, Eleanor Sharpston, the leading counsel. So we won on that point. The one point we didn't win on was the one point I was never allowed to argue, because the cases on which the court relied were never told to me. I never saw them. I didn't know they were being relied on by the judges till I saw the judgment. And we went to the House of Lords. The House of Lords refused leave, and I'm hopeful on that point, which is implied repeal applies to all statutes, will be argued, I hope, in Metric Martyr number 2. But I'm not, at the moment, engaged as counsel in Metric Martyr number 2. So that, I hope, deals with your points on implied repeal. I have been consistent, and we made far more success in Metric Martyr than people give us credit for, and that is the only case, the constitutional case involving community law, that I've actually argued. On other times, people have backed off. The first point you raised is easy to dispose of. Yes, this is basic constitutional law. This is what all constitutional students are taught. It is correct. Parliament can pass a law saying every blue-eyed baby can be put to death. That's because Parliament can do what it likes. There is no legal restraint on Parliament. There are political constraints, there are moral constraints, there are practical restraints. If Parliament said every blue-eyed baby will be put to death, the government would lose the general election because it wouldn't be a popular policy, particularly with blue-eyed baby boys, and all parents of blue-eyed baby boys would vote for the opposition and the Act would be repealed. But there is no doubt it would be an Act while it was on the statute book. Now, of course, in practice, if you went to the army... Well, hang on. That's your second point. I'm coming on to that. Still your first point. If it were on the statute book, it would be law. Nobody would pay any attention to it, but it would be law. But there are lots of acts of Parliament to which nobody pays attention. It is still, unless it's been repealed in the last few years, it was an offence as recently, certainly when I studied law, because I made great play of it and put it in an essay and I wrote an article about it. There was an Act of Parliament passed in the reign of Henry VIII that said all Egyptians could not could not profess to tell fortunes. It was a criminal offence for an Egyptian to tell your fortune. Now, that was almost as silly as the European Communities Act. What had happened was that gypsies had been going around the country telling fortunes, and somebody wanted to outlaw that because they were thought the gypsies were frauds, and somebody got confused and muddled between gypsies and Egyptians. And the Act of Parliament actually said it's a criminal offence for an Egyptian to go around. Now, there were no Egyptians in England, hardly any at all, not a single pharaoh to be seen in England in the 16th century. There had been no Egyptians going around the country promising to tell people's fortunes for cash. But had an Egyptian in 1942 gone around England promising to read somebody's, tell their fortune, that would have been a criminal offence. And he could have been prosecuted, just like the poor lady was prosecuted for being a witch.
Can you answer the question?
I have answered your question, sir. Albert, I have your third point. I'm getting to it. Don't worry. Still dealing with your first point. Now, you say that the Bill of Rights protects cruel and unusual punishment. Yes, it does. But it doesn't stop Parliament providing subsequently for cruel and unusual punishment. And Parliament has done that. Parliament has provided post-1689 for cruel and unusual punishments.
Parliament constantly break the law in this country.
That again it's a fundamental misconception. I know I'm taking time up on it, but it's fundamental. It's nonsense with respect to talk about Parliament breaking the law. Parliament makes the law. Parliament has provided for... You can't get much more cruel and unusual than being hung, drawn and quartered. But after 1689, people were hung, drawn and quartered. The last hanging, drawing and quartering was, I think, about 1780-something. And if you don't think hanging, drawing and quartering... does everybody know about hanging, drawing and quartering? It's pretty cruel. It involves chopping off your wedding tackle and disemboweling people whilst they're still alive and burning your entrails before your eyes whilst you're still alive and then decapitating you. That's cruel. And that was provided for by Parliament after 1689. Your third point is that the Queen cannot give royal assent. Of course the Queen can give royal assent, but she's not obliged to. So in the blue-eyed baby... Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We cannot give you all afternoon. There are other people.
Yes.
You're the next in line, please.
I think I've answered the third point. The Queen need not give royal assent, but once she does so, it becomes law. Sorry, Lindsay, did you want to...
Right.
I'm monopolising the answers. Lindsay is here as well, so I don't want to...
This is very quick. Mr. Shrimpton.
Sorry, Lindsay.
Mr. Shrimpton. I had to take professional advice on this during the tea break, but are you aware that all babies at birth have blue eyes and the pigmentation comes later?
I didn't know that, but then, you see, well, I'm sure it is. Then the Act would say all blue-eyed babies must be killed, so that would say all babies must be killed. It may be that is why we use that as an example. You've probably now explained something to me that I didn't know. Why do constitutional lawyer professors always talk about blue-eyed babies? Because all babies are blue-eyed. So the Act would say all blue-eyed babies must be killed. That would be an act of national suicide, but then you could argue the European Communities Act is an act of national suicide. Harry.
Next question, please. The lady.
You might want to come on.
Joan Martin, for both of you. For 14 years, I've been coming to meetings and listening to you, and you have told us about the past. We need to know today, before we get wiped out, what it is we have to do. And you need to tell us in short, succinct sentences, what have we got to do? This is almost the last meeting we're going to have. It's over to you. You're the lawyer. We need some help.
Well, Chill Lindsay, I've been monopolising the answers. Perhaps Lindsay would like to.
There isn't anything that we can do through the ballot box. That's the first point, and that is the most fundamental point. I think it's got to get an awful lot worse before it gets better, and it may be, rather as Lord Tevitt has said on many occasions, that it will be a case of people taking to the streets, and I don't think he had in mind this country. But of course we're not in this on our own. There are 27 other countries, 26 other countries. So that may be your answer. But there is no democratic means of sorting this out at the present time because there is very little democracy.
Why do you say no democratic means?
Well, we have three major parties in this country. All of them take the same official line on the European Union. None of them is campaigning to pull out of the European Union or renegotiate terms in any meaningful way whatsoever. So it is absolutely pointless voting for any of those parties if the object of the exercise is to leave the European Union. And if you look at, as I already mentioned, if you look at the European Parliament, there's no democracy in that at all. It's just a building with people in it who are going through the motions. And every couple of weeks they vote on a few hundred motions, literally by pressing buttons.
So you think the only answer is on the street?
I do. Yes, I'm not advocating that we rush out and effect revolution, but I'm saying that's what I think will happen when things have got a lot worse than they are today.
Yes, I would advocate a political solution. You make the point that we're speaking about the past. Well, we were both invited today to talk about the European Communities Act 1972. So the theme of today's meeting is how do we get into this mess? Is the European Communities Act, is our membership of the European Union legitimate? And if we don't understand the past, then we're doomed to repeat it. You can't look to the future without understanding the past. Now, Lindsay's right. All three parties at the moment say that membership of the support membership of the EU. However, it's a little more complex than that because the two main parties, the Labour and Tory parties, are coalitions. And in each party there is a substantial number of people who want to pull out of the EU. I'm a Conservative. I want to withdraw from the European Union on Monday. Can't do it today because Parliament isn't sitting. Now, what therefore is required in order to provide for a political solution which I wish to see is for the Conservative Party to move to a position of outright withdrawal. Now, Lindsay is right when she says, with respect, things may have to get worse before they get better. This is why I'm not that worried, and I mean, we will still be having our meetings if you invite me back next year. We will carry on meeting. The Treaty of Lisbon won't stop any activity in this country. It may be passage of the Treaty of Lisbon will help, because inside the Conservative Party it destroys the case for the reformers. Nobody can now say after Lisbon we are in Europe but not run by Europe. Any of that, all that nonsense goes. Now, it may be that the Conservative Party will replace its leader before the next election. As far as the Tory party is concerned, the first priority is to replace David Cameron as leader. That is not as difficult as it sounds, because there is certain intelligence, which I wouldn't need to go into, but there is certain intelligence being used by the bad guys on him, which we now have, and politics is, at the end of the day, he supports membership of the EU. Politics is not very pleasant at times, and it may be that he will have to be forced out. I certainly would support removing him as leader. I didn't vote for him. The man's a fraud. He did, after all, promise to pull us out of the EPP. And that promise is, in my view, clearly fraudulent. Who then replaces him? Well, Michael Ancram, he doesn't want the job, but might be prevailed upon to do it. John Redwood is another strong man. He doesn't come across well on telly, but he has sound opinions, and policy at the end of the day, I think, is more important than personality. Sorry? Bill Cash, yes, again, sound views on Europe. I think Bill will be better off as Attorney General than Prime Minister, but there are people in the Tory party who are opposed. Sorry? No, exactly. Roger Helmer, and I tell you another young man who, Daniel Hannan, is spoken of very highly. And it doesn't have to be an MP, it can be a peer, although we may have to change the party constitution to provide for a peer being leader. I would have Norman Tebbit in a shot, but some would say he's a little bit old. I don't. Well, yes, Enoch Powell was undermined very deliberetely by Edward Heath. That speech he gave in West Midlands, he was set up. The chairman was warned by Central Office and asked to because Central Office had a copy of the speech, the quote that Enoch had about, the Latin quote about the River Tiber, was going to be a classical quote, and it was switched into English in order to set Enoch up. and Enoch's counterintelligence mind wasn't quite fully, his antenna weren't fully tuned in that evening.
Nobody can hear what's happening
Yeah.
unless you speak into the microphone. Unless there is sufficient patriotic instinct amongst the MPs, which there isn't, then we will never get a patriotic leader of the Conservative Party. It's set up not to be patriotic. It was probably subverted decades ago, just like all the other parties. The election system we've got, the so-called parties, are not democratic. It's a one-party state, and it's all designed to move towards world government, of which the EU is just a stepping stone. They're all being bought.
Yes, but I think what has to be... that is partly true, but the Conservative Party rules are not provide for the democratic election of the leader by the party. The problem with Cameron is that someone was able to lie his way into leadership, and it was a huge tactical error by the right to support him. I didn't, and don't blame me for this, I totally opposed to Cameron. I wanted David Davis, who was the best option. I supported Ian Duncan Smith. Ian Duncan Smith, who's a sound Eurosceptic, was elected. He was the first leader elected in the ballot. So it is possible to get a patriotic leader of the Conservative Party. You may be right about the Conservative MPs. The problem that the MPs have is that the majority of members of the Conservative Party are patriotic, and the majority of members of the Conservative Party want out of the EU. And my view is that Lisbon will undermine the position of those Tory MPs who still support membership of the EU, because it will no longer be possible for them to pretend that we are winning the argument in Brussels. So,
if a strong leader does arise, will they do a gate school?
I think we're doing questions on the mic because of the people who are seeing this on the internet, and unless, Bill, do you want to do it from the mic? Because the trouble is the people on the internet listening to this as a screen. If a strong
anti-EU leader does arrive with a majority in this country,
yes,
will they do another gate school?
Do you want to?
Well, that's assuming that your question...
Gate school was a leader of the Labour Party that looked that he might take power and would never agree to going into the EEC. And so Gate school was murdered.
Yes.
Now, will they do it again?
Well, I have to question whether Gateskill was murdered. I had the privilege of knowing one of his closest friends who said that he was very well aware, as were his family, of all the circumstances surrounding his death, but they didn't actually think that he was murdered. They think it was a natural death.
But it was very cleverly done.
Well,
it was.
Everybody was well...
in those days.
Well, it was lupus, but there were questions raised at the time, very considerable questions, but you're saying, would somebody else be murdered? I mean, that's an unanswerable question, isn't it?
But what I'm really saying is they're so ruthless, you better beware.
Yeah, now, my answer is slightly different from Lindsay. There's no doubt that Hugh Gaitskell was assassinated. He died of a tropical disease in London in the middle of winter. London in the middle of winter is not normally the best place to catch a tropical disease. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to catch a tropical disease, my advice is don't try and do it in London in the middle of winter. And it was one of the coldest winters that we've had since the war. It was 1963, remember. Now, the assassination of Gaitskell was done very, very cleverly. It was done by the German DVD using assets inside Polish intelligence and the KGB, Department 13, I think, in Moscow, which was controlled by the DVD. And to some extent, I probably have the advantage of Lindsay over this, because the assassination was run through Moscow, because I have contacts with the Russians, because I've discussed the Gaitskell assassination in Moscow with Russian intelligence officers, and because the Russians have now worked out who the DVD are and now know who is penetrating which sections of their intelligence, we now know a lot more about the Gaitskell assassination. The KGB was split between Russian and German intelligence officers. Remember, the Germans set up Soviet intelligence. CPSU was always a front for German intelligence. Karl Marx worked for Wilhelm Steiber of the Prussian Secret Service. It goes way, way back. Lenin worked for the Germans, Stalin and Trotsky worked for the Germans. The Germans took out Trotsky because of disputes about him not doing what the Germans wanted. The elimination of the Soviet officer class was ordered from Germany. Who benefited from the elimination of the Russian officer class? The Germans. Now, the Soviets know that both the 1905 and 1917 revolutions were bankrolled from Germany, which they were. Lenin, after all, got a sealed train, if you remember. He goes across Germany in a sealed train. Now, that was arranged by the Germans. You couldn't, as a Soviet communist, turn up at a railway station in Zurich in the middle of World War I and say, I want a sealed train, please, first-class ticket, all the way to Moscow. German intelligence set that up. Now, we know about German control of Soviet intelligence. One of the biggest and most powerful players in Eastern Bloc intelligence in the Cold War, someone I knew, somebody asked me a question about him during the tea time interval, was General Oberst Marcus Wolf. He was Abwehr DVD. And I discussed it with him because I knew I was probably one of the few people in England who had Marcus's home phone number in Berlin. And we were enemies, but we talked. And I challenged Marcus about the DVD at a meeting where MI6 were represented, and he confirmed it. And there was little drinkies after this meeting where he also confirmed that they had recruited Edward Heath. I remember one of the MI6 guys having the drinkies didn't know that Heath was working for the Germans and nearly fell out of his chair and turned round to the other MI6 guy who was there was a little group of us, said, is that right, Bill? His name wasn't Bill, but you get the picture. And Bill said, yeah, exactly, I'm afraid so. And Marcus was very annoyed that we had spotted Heath. And when I got to Moscow a few months later, the Russians are tickled because word of this meeting had gone all the way back to Moscow, and the boys were delighted with this and said, we gather you upset Marcus. Now, Marcus was a classic case of German intelligence controlling East Bloc intelligence, and we know that Gaitskell was murdered, and we know it was done by the Germans, and we know they did it because of his opposition to the EEC, and we know that the lupus disseminata they used, the Germans had weaponized it, and the nasty thing about the assassination of Hugh Gaitskell is that it was controlled by Mengelé's unit inside the DVD. I have spoken with intelligence officers who met Mengele post-war. He worked for the DVD, and all of the weaponization trials the Germans had done in Dachau during the war, all of that intelligence stayed in Germany, and the DVD used weaponized lupus, which they had successfully weaponized in Dachau concentration camp in the war. Now, answering Bill's question, how do we, if we get a political leader who wants to pull us out, how do we stop him being assassinated? With a lot better counterintelligence than what came out of MI5 in 1963. We have to be smarter. If we sit back and let our people, our best people, be assassinated, then we deserve all that follows. We have to protect our people. Now, Ian Duncan Smith was another classic. I did try and protect Ian, but he was impervious to advice. He saw everything. If you talked about plots, he saw it at all as a great conspiracy theory, and he didn't understand the extent to which those closest to him, those in his internal office, were working against him. I could, from the outside, see what was happening. I couldn't get warnings to him. I tried my best. Ian wouldn't listen when we did speak, which wasn't... we've had perhaps no more than 2 very brief meetings. And those who I briefed in close to him, who I thought were loyal, turned out to be disloyal. So we have to do a lot better job in the Conservative Party protecting a Eurosceptic leader. We lost IDS through an internal plot, which frankly could have been spotted a mile off and was, and the Labour Party lost Gaitskell, and Britain lost Gaitskell because he was assassinated, because we were outsmarted by the Germans. But you can only get away with that sort of thing once. Forewarned is forearmed.
Michael, 1 or 2 points. Answer them, please, any order you like.
And Lindsay?
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Can you give us some support or the Slovakia question? Does that, and I'd like to add 1 or 2 before you answer, please. Does that mean there's every chance that things will be delayed by that, and perhaps by other countries? You might comment on that, please, in a minute or 2. You also referred to Barak Obama as being very likely to be washed out of the things very, very quickly.
Yep.
On that sort of basis, is there any chance of something even bigger than we've had here, getting rid of Brown and this crowd of no-gooders? Archbishop Centeno has said many things today, which is a great pity that Cameron hasn't said, but he has said them, and I think that will probably continue to reverberate. T'other thing that occurs to me, I thought there was a case going on at the moment with Hackney Council, who also seized some scales recently. Perhaps you might comment on that as well. Thank you.
Lindsay, do you want to comment on this?
That's for you.
Sorry.
That's for you.
I'm conscious that I'm slightly monopolising this, and I apologise to Lindsay if I am. Metric Martyr number 2 is underway. It's next in court on March the 7th, next Friday, but I'm not instructed in that case at the moment. I've been asked if I'll do it pro bono. I have said I'll do it pro bono, but it's up to solicitors. They have to come to me. I can't tell the solicitors who to instruct.
Which case was that?
That's Metric Martyr number 2, the London Borough of Hackney case. Janet Devers is the defendant. But Metric Martyr number 2 gets underway, but we're a long way from the constitutional argument stage, because the strategy in Metric Martyr number 2, as announced publicly, is that she's elected jury trial on some of the charges, and the Crown Court can't deal with the constitutional issue because Thoburn is in the way. So it's only if and when Janet's case gets to the Court of Appeal that there might arguably be a role for me, but I'm bound by the rules of my profession. I can't tout for the case. It's up to Janet and her solicitors. They can have whichever barrister they want. And in any event, even if I were briefed, which is not a matter for me, I can't argue the constitutional point any stage below the Court of Appeal. There is talk of Steve Thoburn's conviction being sent back to the Crown Court by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. And if that is done, which is a matter for the Commission, then the courts could again look at Steve Thoburn's conviction. And we would point out, if that was the case and I were involved, I would point out that the authorities on which the court relied were never shown to me or my opponent, and that the Attorney General's advice was suppressed during the hearing of the case. Your other points on Kenya, doing them in reverse order, yes, I believe that Obama is about to withdraw or be pressured into withdrawing. The reason I think it's happening soon is several reasons. One, I briefed in Senator Edwards's people in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and after my briefing, Senator Edwards called for a meeting with Senator Obama, and Senator Obama appears, I stress appears because I wasn't at the meeting, but appears not to have denied that he was born in Mombasa. Edwards has held back on endorsing Obama. I think that's why. Obviously, I can't speak for Senator Edwards. You'd have to ask him. But I have been in contact with Senator Edwards' campaign people. I've also been in contact with Hillary Clinton's people, and I've been in contact with people close to Bill Clinton and a former Director of Central Intelligence, Director of the CIA when Bill Clinton was President. He has made his own inquiries. I was speaking to him as recently as Friday night. He's not denying that Obama was born in Kenya. The Kenyan government is aware because of files on the National Security Intelligence Service in Nairobi. The Daily Telegraph are aware. The Daily Telegraph have got reporters on the ground in Kenya, and I supplied the names of 4 NSIS senior officials to the Daily Telegraph, and the Daily Telegraph are not denying. The Honolulu press are aware. The fake birth records in Queen's Medical Center, Honolulu, are very obvious fakes, and the Honolulu advertiser with whom I've been in contact are not denying either that the records in Honolulu are fake. Senator McCain's people, I'm in touch with Senator McCain's people. I've been talking to his people for some years on my as you probably know, I want to see Britain leave the EU. I also am looking ahead to what we do when we leave the EU. One of the things I'd like to see is a UK-US free trade treaty, and I put that to Senator McCain's foreign affairs advisors several years ago. So I have contact with Senator McCain's people anyway. Senator McCain's people are not denying that Obama is born in Kenya. I think Senator McCain is in the loop. With all these people in the loop, it's difficult to see how Obama can survive. The reason it's on British intelligence files is because MI5 got the Nairobi Special Branch files in '63 when Kenya became independent. So we shall see what happens. Senator Obama's people have also been in touch with me, and I have spoken probably to their senior US intelligence advisor, a very key player in the Democratic Party, and he, I believe, has spoken with somebody very senior in the Obama camp, and he's not denying it either. So the pressure on Obama is intense. The reason I think we're getting close to a resolution of that is because opposition in Nairobi to Raila Odinga coming in as Prime Minister has now dropped. Part of the reason we lost 1,000 dead in Kenya this year is because there was great anxiety to keep the Obama birth in Mombasa a secret, and there was heavy pressure to keep Raila Odinga out of power in Nairobi. Kofi Annan, I believe, is in the loop. Kofi has been talking to Bill, and Kofi has now dropped away from his opposition to a settlement in Nairobi. That settlement in Nairobi allows Raila Odinga access to the Kenyan NSIS files in Nairobi, and once Raila Odinga gets access to those files, it's all over bar the shouting. Incidentally, Barak Obama has been talking to Raila Odinga and talking to the President of Kenya. How do I know this? Because GCHQ did intercepts because they were talking on an open circuit into Nairobi via Cyprus. The GCHQ listening post in Cyprus picked up those conversations, so the guys on tape, the American National Security Agency, also have those conversations, and my contacts in Washington are not denying that their contacts at NSA are confirming that Obama admitted to being born in Kenya on those tapes. There is a missing sister. This is quite an interesting, it's not really what we're here to talk about, but the question has been asked. There's a missing sister, just to round that off. The Telegraph are aware of a missing sister who was pulled back from UK last year to Kenya. She is said by the Obama camp to be a half-sister, is thought to be a full sister. That means that her DNA would verify that Obama is her brother, not her half-brother, and that would blow away the claimed birth in Queen's Medical Centre, Honolulu, 4th August 1961. The sister has gone walkies, and nobody can find the sister, and the Daily Telegraph, with whom I've been in contact, cannot locate this sister anywhere in Kenya. All they know is she was pulled out of England in a terrible screaming hurry, having gone to an awful lot of trouble to get here. Coming very, very quickly before the next question to your point about Slovakia and Bratislava, interesting, just watch what's happening in Slovakia. It looks as though we've got a deal behind the scenes, which is why I don't want Gordon Brown replaced, because I don't think Brown is committed to the Lisbon Treaty. He says he's committed, but what a politician says and what he does are two different things. Most politicians are scumbags. The good thing about having scumbags as politicians is that the scumbags will say one thing. I'm not calling Gordon Brown a scumbag, but politicians will say one thing and do another. Just because Brown is pushing Lisbon through Parliament does not mean that he has not cut a deal with Putin to pull the treaty in Slovakia. Now, there were discussions between Gordon Brown and the Russians, and where were those discussions held? They were held in Switzerland. Where? At Davos. Why did Gordon Brown go to Davos? Quiet chat with the Russians, I believe. So my sources tell me. Now, if we've cut a deal with the Russians, Brown may be pushing Lisbon in order to keep his party together, which is why he's so opposed to a referendum, and he may be relying on the Slovakians to kill the treaty. All I know is the treaty is indefinitely suspended in Bratislava.
It's all right, Robert. I'm not going to mention the British National Party this time.
A question for Lindsay, I think, because I'm conscious that I'm monopolising all the questions.
Last spring,
Sorry, Lindsay.
Peter came home from one of these meetings and said that you had said we would be out of the EU in 60... let me finish. In 60 days.
Yes.
60 days.
I know.
We got the calendar out and calculated that was his birthday, the 11th of June. What happened?
Yeah, we cut a deal. They cut a deal. We had cut a deal. Gordon Brown, the reason I have some influence in the Brown camp is because twice I've been involved in alerting his people to planned assassinations. This comes back to the question about how do we stop people being assassinated. We keep our eyes and ears open. Twice Gordon Brown has come close to being assassinated. The first time was in January 2005 when an IRA active service unit was landed off a French frigate, mark you, in Cornwall. Now, the Royal Navy are very annoyed about this because they weren't told that a French frigate was just sitting outside the 12-mile limit, and they sent out a helo to say, what's this French frigate doing off the coast of Cornwall? And the French shot our helo down, And then there was heavy pressure from MOD on the Navy not to recover the wreckage, including the bodies of the crew, of our Lynx. Now, you can look these up, but we lost a Lynx in very mysterious circumstances. The MOD put out a bogus story about it responding to a Mayday call, only there was no Mayday call, and there was no ship in distress. Now, that team had a Barrett Light 50 rifle, and the plan was to take him out, I believe, in Downing Street, as he comes between, he's a bit vulnerable as he leaves number 11 and gets into the car. The plan was to take him out from beyond the normal half-mile sniper radius that political protection goes out to. Now, the boys who do the Royal Protection and the Cabinet Protection don't think in terms of sniper ranges at more than half a mile. The Barrett Light 50, they were able to take a shot from 2/3, 3/4 of a mile. And their plan was for this active service unit to take Brown down, and I spotted that. And since the IRA are controlled by the DVD, I'm one of the very few people in the intelligence community with the ability to back-channel the DVD, and this is one of the things I do. I got hold of the DVD and said, right, Guten Abend, sunshines, you've been spotted, back off. And they backed off. And Brown was briefed in long... You're thinking of a shot from ground level. This... No, this was going to be a rooftop shot. There are... There are lines of sight... There are lines of sight that would have permitted... Don't worry, this had been worked out. There are lines of sight that would have permitted a half-mile plus shot. Okay? And I'm not necessarily saying it was Downing Street. I don't know exactly where the kill zone was going to be. But there are kill zones in Whitehall that you can have lines of sight into. It all depends on where your shooter is and the height of the shooter. Okay? If the buildings in Whitehall are not that tall, and you can get lines of sight down into Whitehall, depending on where your shooter is, obviously it has to be set up very carefully. Now, several things happened as a consequence of that. One is I missed out on a fee for a movie called The Shooter, which somebody in the US intelligence community, because the Americans are well aware of this, because the Americans confirmed it to Brown at a meeting when he went to holiday. He turned up to holiday, and a friend of his in the CIA popped along to Longhampton, is it on Long Island, and Brown was briefed in. The bloody CIA didn't give my name to Brown. I had to get it to him by another route, apparently. And somebody took that plot and sold it to some wretched movie maker in Canada who made a marvellous movie about it called The Shooter, which is all about the Barrett Light 50, the shooting range. Everything's there, except it's translated from Britain to the United States because it's aimed for the American market. And I never got a fee for that. I'm really irritated about that.
Never mind. I'm actually not going to ask a question. I just would like to put forward a point of view, a very non-academic point of view. We seem to go around in circles. We can go around in circles for days, weeks, months, years, and we'll never get out. We'll still be in the EU. We'll never have our sovereignty. May I suggest that a very simple way, if people like the ordinary man in the street doesn't understand all these legal terms and the interpretations, there was a very good book written by the late Daphne du Maurier called Rule Britannia. On this subject, she had a crystal ball, and I would suggest that everybody read this book, and I think they would understand it. It's all in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I haven't read... Do you know I've never read Daphne du Maurier? I think I must acquire this book.
A very quick question to both of you, please. What advice do you think the German courts are going to give to the President over the Constitution Reform Lisbon Treaty that they're considering at the moment?
Sorry, Bill, what?
What advice do you think the German courts are going to give to the German President?
That's for you.
Okay. Now, just quickly finishing off the bit of the question I answered, Paul, there was a deal, and it fell apart because Brown didn't get rid of John Scarlett. The key is Scarlett. And once Scarlett was retained, the deal collapsed. But the deal was pull us out of the EU, and you get into number 10, we're out of the EU, the Germans stiffed us, and Scarlett, once I knew the deal had fallen apart as soon as, the whole thing's deniable. I mean, this was never proved, denied officially, like most things are, but the deal fell apart because Scarlett got in the way, and Scarlett was working with various friends across the Channel. So we're now trying to, we're moving forward. That was Plan A. We're now working on Plan B. The German Constitutional Court will depend, I think, very much on how things move in Germany with the Merkel government. There is a theory in Germany that if the Germans push Lisbon too hard, that either we will pull out of the EU, which some people in Germany don't want us to do, or it will trigger war between Britain and Germany. Senior strategic officials, intelligence, military planners are already looking at the possibility of another Anglo-German war being triggered by Angela Merkel's goose-stepping over Lisbon, no offence intended. So there are people in Germany, and I'm having phone calls and discussions and all the rest of it, who are worried about Lisbon, worried about the EU being broken up because we pull out because of Lisbon, and also worried that such is the strength of feeling against Germany now, such is the anti-EU feeling, such is the anger in Britain, such is the corrosive effect of it being exposed that even, albeit inside the intelligence community, that Germany was behind the IRA, 3,000 casualties organised from Germany, German involvement in Al-Qaeda, all of this is coming out, and it's got some people in the foreign ministry very worried, and there are people who think that if they don't get a hold of this, in 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to end up with another Anglo-German war. And I think that's a possibility. If the Germans cannot get a grip, if they carry on in this goose-stepping fashion, then we are going to end up like we were in 1939. Now, the way to stop wars happening is for people with statesman-like ability to see them coming, to take the necessary steps, and there are people in Germany who are leaning on the Constitutional Court. How do you lean on the Constitutional Court? You have them round for schnapps. There are people in Germany who want the Constitutional Court to stop Lisbon. So it will very much depend on the dynamics of what's happening. There is a move to scrap Merkel. Merkel could go as soon as this year. She's been talked about as President of the European Union, which is actually is probably going to be a non-job. She's been talked about non-job in Brussels because her coalition is falling apart. And this pressure is one of the reasons. Okay? So there are people in Germany who do not want a war between Britain and Germany. The Russians are helping because Russia has put enormous pressure on Germany by pulling out of the Conventional Forces Limitation Treaty and moving tactical air force units, motorized infantry under its modern guise, and armour west of the Urals. So Russia's strategic emphasis is now anti-Germany, not anti-China, and the Germans can see this. Every Russian battalion that is moved west of the Urals gets noticed in Berlin, and the Germans know we are talking to the Russians. One of the reasons why we've got Tupolev 95 Bears in British airspace at the moment is to allow the RAF and the Russian Air Force to work together. That's why the Bears are there. The Russians are putting aircraft into our airspace to get their pilots and our pilots working together. The Germans are noticing this and saying, Jawohl, oh dear, Gott im Himmel. The Germans know that if it came to war, if Britain signs up with Russia, as we did in 1914, and Denmark, and the Germans are very worried about Denmark coming into World War I, and very worried about Denmark coming in early in World War II, if we've got Denmark on side, and Russia and Poland, then the Germans are finished, because we don't need to do nonsense like Normandy and D-Day invasions, because with the Danes on board, we just go in through Denmark, and the Russians come in through Poland. So strategically, the Germans can see, hang on a minute, I know Harry's sort of not agreeing with me, but strategically the Germans are thinking, this is not good. And there are people in Germany wise enough to say, we need to back off, because Germany is not strong enough militarily to take on Britain, Poland, Russia, Denmark. Those are the 4 countries. You get us on board, Russians on board, Danes on board, Poles on board, and the Germans are finished. We'll knock them down in 30, 60 days.
Everything seems to lead back with you to Germany. I don't believe a word of it. We've got 5 minutes now. Okay.
Sorry, Lindsay, I'm
That's right. No, that's absolutely fine.
I apologise if this is essentially simplistic, but at the end of the day, having listened to all this, what practical advice have you to give us to wake the population of this country up to the problems that face them?
Lindsay.
Very good. That's an excellent question, and I think many of us are already doing exactly that, which is the letter writing, the talking, the dissemination on the internet, and we have achieved. I mean, I started being involved in this long after some people, but in 1992, that was when I met Michael, I think.
Yes.
Through the Bruges Group in Maastricht. And so it's a long time that we've been battling away, but we were considered to be very, very odd at the time of Maastricht, and there were hardly any of us. And now there are an awful lot of us, and I think that pretty much says it. But I would sound one little note of caution on all this. We had more people when we were fighting the Maastricht Bill, because I was in Bill Cash's group at Great College Street.
So?
There were more people we had in the House of Commons on the Conservative side who were on our side than we have today. It's actually gone down within the House of Commons. It's not a good trend.
Russians come through Poland, we go through Denmark. Deal done. Do you want an answer from me to that?
No, last question. I'm sorry, we'll come to the end of this. Sorry, Peter, we'll come to the end of the tape.
Oh, I see. No tape, no questions.
No more questions.
Is it essential we have it on the tape?
No. You want to take? We can take a question. We can.
When we reach the end of the session, you all have a lot of questions to ask. It's only fair that we give our speakers a chance to rest after their labours. I think we've covered nearly everything. I personally am dying to ask a question. I disagree on something with Michael. I disagree about Germany and so on. But I can't really bring myself as chairman to set up a new session for Michael to keep another half an hour.
Larry will approve it. Go for it. Go for it. We normally go on until 5 o'clock.
I don't think we've even scratched the surface on Germany properly.
Well, I agree with that.
Robert, we normally go on until 5 o'clock.
My book called German Rights. I'm sorry, there's no question. Pardon? It's got to down to Titanic. You mustn't interrupt the chairman. It's never done.
Yeah.
So without more ado, I'm going to make a presentation to our guests, and if any of you have anything to make as a statement afterwards, I'm sure you will be free with Fern's permission, because she's in charge of the microphone. Remember, we're not just sole speakers, we're under surveillance, which allows proportion.
Thank you.
Now, as I said at the beginning, we have the privilege of not one, but two very special speakers. We've tried to present...
Is that Lindsay? How sweet.
Two very special gifts for them.
No, hang on. That's Lindsay. That's yours.
Oh, is it?
Yes. I'm the doctor. It's Lindsay. Thank you. Oh, that looks lovely.
Very much.
How splendid. Oh, how splendid. How very nice. Done in respect of Barak Obama's claimed grandparents. I understand the CIA were unable to obtain a match. The CIA did it very well. I believe they did it at a fundraising dinner, and it's absolutely marvellous. If you want to do a DNA test, nothing better than a glass of water. Because what you get with a glass of water, you get saliva for your DNA, and you've got fingerprints as well. It's an all-in-one, do-it-yourself, DIY DNA testing kit. And all the CIA did was slip in. You don't have to ask somebody to do a DNA test. They just took away a couple of glasses. Bag one for grandpa, bag one for grandpa, do a DNA test, no link, end of case. It's quite funny. Rudy Giuliani's people, this is an aside, but I think people are interested because Obama is making a lot of headway at the moment. Rudy Giuliani's people bought me lunch last year because they knew I knew, and Rudy's people were fascinated by this, and he decided to sit on it, apparently, and hold the intelligence back in the hope that he would be the Republican candidate, because he was then being talked about as the front runner, and then he could bounce it on the Democratic Party after the convention in August, which is absolutely crazy. I've been talking to Hillary Clinton's people who seem quite interested. So I don't think it'll be staying secret for much longer. So it's been a good year so far. Now, I'm now going to talk about what I've been asked to talk about, which is very rare for me, for those who've heard me before. Normally I talk about everything else that's not on the agenda. The legitimacy of our membership of the European community. Well, we should approach this logically. Unlike Bob Lomas, no offence intended, we should approach it logically. Is our membership legal? Is it in accordance with constitutional principle, which is a different question altogether? And in the international plane, are we bound by the treaties? Why do I draw a distinction in what happens domestically and what happens internationally? Because we are a dualist jurisdiction. And in a dualist jurisdiction, treaties like this only take effect in the international plane. This treaty is not law. It can only be made law by Parliament, which is why we have the European Union Amendment Act going through, or the European Union Amendment Bill. If the bill is granted royal assent, and it may not be, entirely a matter for the Queen whether she grants royal assent or not, entirely a matter for the House of Lords whether they impose a referendum requirement. It may not make its way through the House of Lords. I suspect it won't. I suspect there will be a referendum successful amendment in the House of Lords. Note, for those who are interested in the treaty, the ratification of this treaty is currently suspended in Slovakia. Yes. The media have not picked up that, probably because they confused Slovakia with Slovenia and all went down to Zagreb instead of Bratislava, or what's the capital of Slovenia? It's not Zagreb. Zagreb's Croatia.
That's true.
But they are legislation. Now, the Witchcraft Act, which was last used in 1944, I don't know if people realise that, the Telegraph covered it recently. The Witchcraft Act was most recently used in England for a prosecution in 1944, when a medium was prosecuted for witchcraft and adjudged to be a witch. That was completely stupid, but lawful, because the Act of Parliament, the Witchcraft Act, was still in place, and Parliament can do what it likes. And if we all know there are no witches, but if Parliament says there are witches, then as far as the law is concerned, there are witches. And this poor lady was prosecuted and sent to prison for 2 years for being a witch. Now, there's an interesting historical intelligence background to that, because none other than Winston Churchill, when still Prime Minister, went to see this lady in prison. Why did Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, go to see a witch who had been sent to prison for 2 years? Because at the séance, which led to such hysteria, she had announced that HMS Barham had been sunk in the Med in November 41, and that at that stage was still very much on the secret list. You may recall the tragic photograph. The German intelligence had ambushed the Barham, and somebody arranged in naval intelligence to have the battleship next to head in line. There was somebody with a camera. Normally you don't see battleships being torpedoed and sunk, because normally it comes as a surprise. In a well-ordered naval battle, we like the Navy to be taken by surprise by a torpedo. And normally people are not there at sea in wartime with a camera already rolling as the ship is torpedoed. In this particular case, somebody was there waiting with a camera as the torpedo went in. The poor old Barham got hit in the magazines and went over. The reason Churchill was interested was the name of the spy, and he probably thought the medium knew the name of the British spy who betrayed HMS Barham's course to the Germans through the German ambassador in Ankara, Franz von Papen, who was, of course, close to German intelligence, so close he was actually part of it. And who was that spy? None other than Harold Macmillan, who took us, or tried to take us, into the EEC, who was exposed as a German spy in International Currency Review, volume 30, number 4, and I'd strongly recommend it, published in the autumn of 2005. And I suspect Churchill, even as early as 1944, had suspicions about Harold Macmillan. He also betrayed HMS Ark Royal, which had sunk a few days earlier from memory. Now, because Parliament can enact the Witchcraft Act, the Dangerous Dogs Act, the Human Rights Act, it follows that the European Communities Act is law. Constitutional lawyers are taught this year one when you study constitutional law, the rule is the blue-eyed baby rule. For some reason, at some point, some constitutional professor must have been annoyed by somebody with blue eyes or didn't like Frank Sinatra's records. I don't know, but it's always expressed as the blue-eyed baby rule. Parliament can enact a law which says that every blue-eyed baby shall be killed. And if the House of Lords approved it, and if the Queen were to give assent, of course she wouldn't.
Too fast a ball for me.
Sorry? Ljubljana, yes, yes. Remind me, I've never been to Slovenia. I've been to Croatia. Sorry? Yes. Exactly. I've been to Croatia, but I don't think I've ever been to Slovenia. The media are probably confusing the two. Slovakia is the country where the treaty is held up. The opposition have more sufficient votes in the Slovakian parliament to block approval of the treaty. It requires a special majority. Although they don't have a simple majority to block the treaty, they have sufficient numbers to block the ratification. And in Slovakia, it is, in Bratislava, it is suspended indefinitely. Now, when it's going to come back in, we don't know. The rumour in the intelligence community, and as you know, I'm not a spy, ladies and gentlemen, I just teach spies and do the odd bit of analysis for them and bail them out of trouble when they get into trouble, and spies do occasionally get into the odd bit of legal trouble. Not everything they do is entirely lawful. So I only advise spies and teach spies. I'm not a spy. But the word in the intelligence community is that we cut a deal with the Russians over Slovakia. The Russian SVR has very good connections in Bratislava. Surprise, surprise, it used to run the place. And when it was the KGB. And the rumour, although I can't confirm this, it's only a rumour, the rumour is we cut a deal to bump off that idiot Georgian who surprisingly dropped dead of a heart attack just a couple of weeks ago, and that happened about 2 days after Slovakian Parliament blocked the Treaty of Lisbon. But it's only a rumour. I'd be fascinated to know exactly who was doing what to whom. But because the treaty only operates in the international plane, you have to get an Act of Parliament through in order to incorporate it. If there was no European Communities Act, nothing in the Treaty of Rome would be lawful in this country at all. Now, it is also the case under the British Constitution that Parliament is supreme. Parliament can do whatever it likes. I know there's a group of people, including Bob Lomas and others, who waste a lot of time and in some cases money with pointless legal challenges, pretending that Parliament cannot enact any law that it wants whatsoever. Parliament can do whatever it likes, providing the Queen gives royal assent, which is essential, providing it goes through the House of Lords and the House of Commons, subject to the Parliament Act procedure. What you end up with is an act, and that is the law of the land. Now, the fact we may not like the European Communities Act, I'll take questions there, providing it's the law, providing it's enacted, then it is the law of the land. You don't have to like it. It doesn't have to be sensible. Parliament has passed a lot of daft legislation, the Witchcraft Act, the European Communities Act, the Dangerous Dogs Act, the Human Rights Act, the Lisbon Treaty Act. I mean, all these are daft, ridiculous bits of legislation. It's autobiography. If nobody's bought it, you should invest in a copy. It's an excellent piece of writing, and Harry has a most interesting history, as you probably know. Now, I'm probably a little bit more upbeat than Lindsay. It's been a good year for the good guys, generally. Dmitry Medvedev is about to win the very democratic election, which is being held in Russia. He's the candidate not backed by the Germans, so the pro-German press and pro-German NGOs are, of course, rubbishing him, but he's a very nice chap, I'm told, and so is President Putin. Prince Harry has been doing good work shooting up Terry Taliban, which is marvellous to see, upsetting the radical Muslims, which is also very encouraging. He was, of course, defending good Muslims out in Afghanistan, including that very nice man, Hamid Karzai. And I think that the very fact that we were able to get Prince Harry out of Afghanistan shows that things are changing a little bit in Whitehall. Tony Blair was totally opposed to Harry going into active service for obvious reasons, because the man was a closet Republican. That was a very, very encouraging development indeed, and that, of course, has gone all the way around the world. We've had excellent snow this winter, which has blown away the global warming nutters. Most global warming nutters these days, how to tell a global warming nutter, because they've all got flu in winter, because they'll throw away their winter woolies. Or they're stuck by the side of the road because they gave up their snow tyres, winter tyres, and snow chains. It's absolutely marvellous. Snow cover is the greatest it's ever been for decades, probably since the 1930s. And the whole global warming thing is just starting to fall apart, which is very, very encouraging. And Obama, Senator Barak Hussein Obama, is about to come a cropper in the United States. So it's been a pretty good year. For those who don't know the problem with Obama, and by the time this is viewed on the internet, it will probably be all over the newspapers. He was born in Mombasa in Kenya. It's very interesting because that sits on British intelligence files. His father was close to the Mau Mau. He used to run guns and money into the Mau Mau. He was a link man between the Mau Mau and the German intelligence network in East Africa. And Obama was born in Mombasa in about 1960. His mother, we think, was one of Obama Sr.'s many mistresses. And the woman who is now dead, who was allegedly his mother, wasn't pregnant in July 1961, but Barak Hussein Obama claims to have been born in Honolulu on August 4th, 1961. Now, we have a doctor here, and Dr. Lister would, I think, confirm. I'm not a medical man, but my understanding is that if a lady's giving birth in August, we like to see her pregnant in July. Since it's been established that his mother, alleged mother, wasn't pregnant in the July, his claimed birth on 4th August does seem to be coming under a certain degree of scrutiny. It's also nice to have a DNA relationship with your parents and the DNA test. But if she were, then every blue-eyed baby, in theory, would be liable to be killed. So if Parliament can say that every blue-eyed baby or every second blue-eyed baby can be put to death, then Parliament can enact the European Communities Act. It doesn't matter how daft, how stupid, how crazy a bill is, if Parliament approves it, it becomes law. And there is no point going to a court of law and saying we don't like this Act of Parliament. This has happened. I know there's a crowd of Eurosceptics who over the years have been enthralled with this idea that the European Communities Act isn't valid and you can go off to court and challenge it. All these challenges have failed, and rightly so, because they're all completely misconceived, because there's no point going to a court of law and saying to the judge, I don't like X Act of Parliament. The judge will say, tough, I've duty bound to apply it. Mike Burke tried it when he challenged the Firearms Act 1997. Now, the Firearms Act 1997 was a completely stupid piece of legislation, blaming shooters for the shooting at Dunblane. There was no problem with firearms law. The problem was that we gave guns to a nutter who happened to be running a paedophile ring, who happened to have paedophiles in the police force that he was supplying children to. Therefore, he got protection. Therefore, he got a firearms certificate that he shouldn't have got. But that was because he had protectors in the police force. Nothing to do with firearms legislation. There was nothing wrong with the legislation. It was just the way it was being worked. The Parliament had a hissy fit, and the shooters were prosecuted in a great moral fit of outrage, totally unnecessary, and somebody went to court and said the Firearms Act is illegal because it breaches the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights says every Protestant has the right to bear arms, and Mike Burke went along and said, hey, I'm a Protestant, I'm in the Church of whatever, Church of England, I'm a Protestant, I have a right to bear arms, this act cannot apply to me because of the Bill of Rights. Wrong, case chucked out, and rightly so. So the European Communities Act is undoubtedly law. However, and I will take questions later, however, the other side of the coin, which is equally uncomfortable to Euro nutters, is that Parliament remains sovereign. It's omnipotent in all save the power to destroy its own omnipotence, as Sir Robert McGarry said in 1982 in the Canadian Indians case, ex parte manual. It's Queen versus Attorney General of Canada, ex parte manual. The Parliament remains sovereign and omnipotent, and it follows that whatever Parliament can do, it can also undo. So although Parliament enacted the European Communities Act, it can also repeal it. And the law of this country is quite clear that Parliament can override all previous legislation without referring to it, impliedly or expressly. Now, that is what we argued in Metric Martyr. And in Metric Martyr, the courts accepted at least half of our argument. The courts accepted that the European Communities Act could be repealed, that there had been no loss of sovereignty.